Inside one of America's most feared prisons, power doesn't disappear, it adapts. In Pelican Bay's isolation units, some of the most dangerous inmates learned how to control entire networks without ever leaving their cells. Orders were whispered through walls, hidden in codes, and carried beyond prison gates. Before we uncover these unseen power plays, subscribe now for real, fact-based prison documentaries that expose what most people never see. Now, step inside Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay State Prison was built to break control. By the late 1980s, California's prison system had reached a breaking point. Violence inside correctional facilities was no longer random, it was organized. Prison gangs had evolved into structured organizations with leadership hierarchies, rules, and systems of enforcement that extended far beyond prison walls. Correctional officials realized something unsettling. Incarceration wasn't stopping criminal influence. In some cases, it was strengthening it. Gang leaders used prison time to consolidate authority. From inside cells, they issued orders that reached neighborhoods across California. Murders, drug operations, and extortion networks were being coordinated from within the very system designed to contain them. Pelican Bay was California's answer. Opened in 1989 near the remote coastline of Northern California, the prison was designed with one central goal: isolate the most influential inmates and dismantle their ability to control others. At the heart of this strategy was the Security Housing Unit, or SHU. The SHU was not just a high-security unit. It was a controlled environment engineered to remove human interaction almost entirely. Inmates were placed in single cells, separated from one another with minimal contact even with correctional staff. Movement was restricted. Communication was limited. The assumption was simple: without interaction, power would collapse. But something unexpected happened. Power adapted. Inmates who had spent years building influence did not simply abandon it when placed in isolation. Instead, they found new ways to maintain control: quieter, more calculated, and often harder to detect. Communication became the key. Despite the SHU's design, inmates developed methods to pass information. Some used coded language in letters, disguising instructions within seemingly harmless correspondence. Others relied on legal mail, which was subject to different inspection rules, to transmit messages. Even artwork, poetry, and written notes could carry hidden meaning understood only by those familiar with gang structures. Inside the SHU, voices still traveled. Inmates shouted through vents, tapped messages along pipes, and developed sound-based communication systems. Over time, these methods evolved into complex networks that allowed information to move between cells despite physical separation. Correctional intelligence units worked constantly to decode these systems. Officers monitored mail, tracked patterns, and gathered intelligence from informants. But the battle was ongoing. Every new control measure was met with a new workaround. The most influential inmates were known as shot callers. These individuals held authority within gang hierarchies. Their word carried weight. Orders issued from inside prison could lead to action outside. Loyalty to these figures was often enforced through strict codes, and violations could carry severe consequences. For law enforcement, this created a difficult challenge. Even in isolation, these inmates retained influence. Removing them from general population reduced direct violence inside prisons, but it did not completely sever their connection to external networks. Pelican Bay became a silent battlefield. On one side were correctional officials using isolation to disrupt organized crime. On the other were inmates adapting to maintain power through indirect means. The struggle was not always visible. There were no large-scale riots inside the SHU. No chaotic yard fights. Instead, the conflict unfolded through intelligence reports, intercepted messages, and ongoing investigations into how information moved within the prison system. Over time, Pelican Bay became one of the most studied prisons in America. Researchers, legal experts, and human rights organizations examined its operations. The SHU's use of long-term solitary confinement drew national attention. Critics argued that indefinite isolation caused severe psychological harm. Supporters maintained that it was necessary to control the most dangerous individuals in the system. The debate intensified as stories emerged from inside. Inmates described spending years, sometimes decades, in small concrete cells. They spoke of silence, of time losing meaning, of the difficulty of maintaining mental stability. Yet within that silence, some continued to exert influence in ways that were not immediately visible. Pelican Bay revealed a deeper truth about power inside prisons. Isolation could remove physical presence, but it did not automatically erase authority. Power in prison systems is not always based on proximity. It is based on reputation, loyalty, and the ability to communicate, even under extreme restriction. As California's prison system evolved, so did its strategies. Intelligence units expanded. Monitoring systems improved. Policies regarding gang validation and SHU placement came under legal scrutiny. Hunger strikes and court challenges would eventually force reforms that reshaped how isolation was used. But during its peak years, Pelican Bay represented something unique. It was a place where some of the most dangerous inmates in the country were placed into near-total isolation, and yet, in some cases, still found ways to influence the world beyond their cells. The unseen power plays inside Pelican Bay were not about physical dominance. They were about adaptation. And to understand how those power structures operated, we must look closer at the networks behind them, the gangs, the hierarchies, and the methods used to maintain control in a system designed to eliminate it. Because inside Pelican Bay, silence did not mean inactivity. It meant the game had changed. Pelican Bay's security housing unit was designed to stop communication. No shared cells. No open yards. No physical contact. Every movement controlled. Every interaction monitored. On paper, it was a system built to cut every line of influence. But inside the SHU, communication didn't disappear. It changed form. For inmates who had spent years operating within structured gang hierarchies, communication was not optional, it was survival. Authority depended on the ability to send and receive information. Orders, updates, warnings, these were the lifelines of influence. And even in isolation, those lifelines found a way. One of the simplest methods was sound. Despite thick concrete walls, sound could still travel in limited ways. Inmates learned to shout through vents or along door seams at specific angles. Over time, they developed patterns, coded phrases, shortened messages, and timing strategies to avoid detection. Communication wasn't constant, but it was enough. More sophisticated systems emerged through tapping. Using knuckles or small objects, inmates tapped against walls or pipes in rhythmic patterns. These patterns could represent letters or words, similar to Morse code but adapted to prison conditions. A sequence of taps could carry a message across cells, passed from one inmate to another down a tier. It was slow, but it worked. Then there was written communication. Mail became one of the most powerful tools inside Pelican Bay. Every piece of outgoing and incoming mail was subject to inspection, but inmates learned how to write in layers. Messages could be disguised within letters that appeared harmless. Certain words, phrases, or even punctuation patterns carried hidden meaning understood only by those within the network. Some inmates used coded language rooted in gang culture. Others embedded instructions within drawings or artwork. To an untrained eye, a letter might look like casual correspondence. To someone on the outside, it could contain directives. Legal mail presented another challenge. Correspondence between inmates and attorneys is protected under legal confidentiality rules. While procedures exist to inspect such mail for contraband, its content is generally not read in the same way as standard mail. This created a narrow channel that some inmates attempted to exploit. Correctional authorities were aware of this risk. Mailrooms became intelligence hubs. Staff were trained to identify suspicious patterns, unusual writing styles, or repeated coded elements. Letters could be flagged, copied, and analyzed. Entire investigative units focused on decoding communication methods used by inmates. But the system was not perfect. In a facility housing individuals skilled in evasion and manipulation, every control measure had limits. Another method involved intermediaries. Even in isolation, inmates had indirect connections to the outside world. Family members, associates, or legal contacts could act as links between individuals. A message sent out through mail or conveyed during a visit could reach someone on the outside who could then pass it along. This created what investigators sometimes described as relay communication. One message could move through multiple people before reaching its final destination. The complexity made detection difficult. Correctional intelligence units relied on patterns rather than single messages. A single letter might mean nothing. But multiple letters, sent to different recipients with similar coded elements, could reveal a larger structure. Technology also played a role, though limited. Unlike modern facilities with advanced digital communication systems, Pelican Bay's SHU operated largely without direct inmate access to electronic devices. But as technology evolved outside prison walls, so did investigative techniques. Law enforcement agencies began coordinating more closely with prison officials. Intelligence gathered inside Pelican Bay could connect to criminal investigations outside. Patterns of communication, financial transactions, and known associations were cross-referenced. Still, the challenge remained constant. How do you stop communication among individuals who have spent years learning how to operate under restriction? The answer was never absolute. Instead, it became a continuous cycle of adaptation. As officials tightened controls, inmates refined methods. As new codes were identified, new ones replaced them. The process resembled a long-term contest of strategy rather than a one-time solution. Inside the SHU, this invisible exchange of information shaped daily life. Not every inmate participated. Some chose isolation from these networks. Others focused on legal appeals, personal survival, or simply enduring the passage of time. But for those connected to organized structures, communication remained central. It reinforced identity. It maintained hierarchy. And it allowed influence to persist, even in a system designed to erase it. Correctional officers working in the SHU understood this reality. Their role extended beyond physical security. They were part of an intelligence environment. Observing behavior, documenting interactions, and identifying subtle patterns became part of daily operations. Training emphasized awareness. A small change, a repeated phrase, a pattern of letters, a shift in behavior, could signal something larger. Officers and investigators worked together to interpret these signals, often with incomplete information. The stakes were high. Messages that moved through these networks could influence actions beyond prison walls. Even limited communication had potential consequences. Yet, despite all efforts, total silence was never achieved. Pelican Bay's SHU demonstrated a critical lesson about control systems. You can restrict movement. You can isolate individuals. But eliminating communication entirely is far more complex. Because communication is not just physical, it is adaptive. And in environments of extreme restriction, adaptation becomes sharper, more deliberate, and often more difficult to detect. These hidden systems of communication were only one part of the power structure inside Pelican Bay. To fully understand how influence operated, we must examine the individuals at the center of it, the shot callers, the hierarchies, and the internal rules that govern loyalty and authority within prison gangs. Because communication alone does not create power. It sustains it. And inside Pelican Bay, power was never just about who was strongest. It was about who could still be heard, even in silence. Inside Pelican Bay, power did not come from physical presence. It came from structure. By the time inmates arrived at the security housing unit, many had already spent years, sometimes decades, operating within organized prison gangs. These groups were not loose affiliations. They functioned with defined hierarchies, internal rules, and systems of discipline that mirrored structured organizations on the outside. At the top of these structures were individuals often referred to as shot callers. The term itself carries weight. A shot caller is not simply a senior member. It is someone whose decisions influence others. Someone whose authority is recognized across multiple levels of the organization. In prison systems, that authority can extend beyond a single facility. For correctional officials, these individuals represented a unique challenge. Unlike general population inmates, shot callers were not necessarily involved in day-to-day confrontations. Their influence operated at a different level, through communication, reputation, and long-established loyalty networks. Pelican Bay's SHU was designed specifically to isolate these figures. The assumption was clear: remove leadership and the structure collapses. But hierarchies are resilient. Even in isolation, the identity of a shot caller did not disappear. In many cases, it became more symbolic, a role maintained through reputation rather than direct interaction. Years of influence could not be erased by physical separation alone. Within prison gangs, structure is everything. Organizations such as the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and Black Guerrilla Family historically operated with layered hierarchies. Leadership tiers determined who issued orders, who enforced them, and who carried them out. At the highest levels, decisions were strategic. Below them, members executed instructions. And at every level, loyalty was reinforced through strict codes. Inside Pelican Bay, these structures did not function in the same visible way as in general population units. There were no group meetings, no open displays of leadership. Instead, hierarchy became abstract, maintained through communication systems and shared understanding. A message did not need to be spoken face-to-face to carry authority. If it came from a recognized source, it was enough. Reputation played a critical role. Inmates who had established influence over years, through actions, alliances, or leadership roles, carried that status with them into the SHU. Even without direct contact, their names held weight. For younger or lower-ranking members outside the SHU, that reputation could still shape behavior. This created a layered dynamic. Inside the SHU, leadership existed in isolation. Outside, within general population units or on the streets, individuals acted on that perceived authority. Correctional intelligence units worked continuously to map these relationships. Officers tracked affiliations, monitored communications, and documented patterns of influence. Over time, they developed profiles of key individuals, identifying who held authority within specific groups and how that authority might manifest. But mapping influence is not the same as controlling it. The decentralized nature of these structures made them difficult to dismantle entirely. When one leader was isolated, another could emerge. When communication channels were disrupted, new ones formed. Pelican Bay became a testing ground for understanding how power operates under extreme restriction. One of the most complex aspects of this system was enforcement. In traditional settings, discipline within a gang might involve direct confrontation. Inside the SHU, enforcement became indirect. Orders could be passed outward and consequences could occur elsewhere. This separation between decision and action added a layer of distance that made accountability harder to trace. For investigators, connecting an instruction issued inside Pelican Bay to an action carried out outside required detailed intelligence work, often involving multiple agencies. Despite these challenges, isolation did have measurable effects. Removing key figures from general population disrupted immediate coordination. It reduced direct recruitment. It limited the ability to organize within shared spaces. But it did not eliminate hierarchy. Instead, it transformed it. Leadership became less visible, more symbolic, and in some ways more difficult to detect. At the same time, not every inmate in the SHU held influence. Many were placed there based on validation criteria that included association rather than proven leadership roles. Some inmates had limited or no involvement in structured gang activity. For them, the experience of isolation was not tied to maintaining power, but to enduring confinement. This distinction became central to legal challenges against SHU policies. Critics argued that indefinite isolation based on perceived affiliation blurred the line between leadership and association. Supporters maintained that preventative measures were necessary to maintain safety. The debate highlighted a deeper issue. How do you identify power in a system where influence is not always visible? Inside Pelican Bay, the answer was never simple. Power could exist without movement. Authority could persist without presence. And hierarchy could survive even in silence. Over time, reforms began to reshape this landscape. As California moved away from indefinite SHU placements and introduced structured step-down programs, many inmates who had spent years in isolation were returned to general population. This created a new dynamic. Individuals who once operated as isolated figures were reintroduced into shared environments. Some adapted. Others struggled. The transition raised questions about how long-term isolation affects behavior, identity, and the ability to reintegrate, even within a prison setting. For correctional officials, the challenge shifted. It was no longer only about isolating leadership. It was about managing the reemergence of individuals who had spent years removed from direct interaction. Pelican Bay's history revealed something fundamental about power structures in correctional systems. You can confine individuals. You can separate them. But the systems they built, the hierarchies, the codes, the reputations, do not disappear easily. They evolve. And sometimes they become harder to see. The unseen power plays inside Pelican Bay were not about constant movement or visible control. They were about persistence. About the ability of structure to survive under pressure. And about the reality that even in the most controlled environments, influence can find a way to exist. But the story of Pelican Bay does not end with power structures. It reaches a turning point, one driven not by authority but by resistance. Because eventually, the inmates inside those concrete cells did something that forced the entire system to respond. They stopped eating. 4 years, Pelican Bay's security housing unit operated in near silence. Not just the physical silence of concrete walls and steel doors, but institutional silence. Policies were enforced, routines repeated, and the outside world paid limited attention to what was happening inside the SHU. That silence broke in 2011. It didn't begin with violence. It began with refusal. A small group of inmates inside Pelican Bay made a decision. They would stop eating. The hunger strike was not spontaneous. It was organized, deliberate, and rooted in a set of specific demands. These demands focused on conditions inside the SHU, particularly the practice of indefinite solitary confinement based on gang validation, the use of debriefing as a pathway out, and the lack of meaningful programming. For inmates who had spent years, in some cases decades, in isolation, the hunger strike became a form of protest that did not rely on physical confrontation. It relied on endurance. Word spread quickly. Despite the restrictions of the SHU, communication networks carried the message beyond Pelican Bay. Within days, inmates in other California prisons joined in solidarity. The strike expanded far beyond its point of origin. Thousands of inmates across the state refused meals. For correctional officials, the situation presented a complex challenge. Hunger strikes are difficult to manage. They are nonviolent, but they carry serious medical risks. As days passed, medical staff began monitoring participants closely. Weight loss, weakness, and health complications became immediate concerns. The state faced increasing pressure. Advocacy groups, legal organizations, and media outlets began covering the strike. Families of inmates spoke publicly. Questions were raised about the use of long-term solitary confinement and the conditions inside Pelican Bay. Negotiations began. Representatives for the inmates communicated their demands through written statements. Prison officials responded with policy explanations and proposed changes. The process was slow, complicated by mistrust on both sides. After several weeks, many participants ended the strike. But the issue did not disappear. In 2013, a second, larger hunger strike began. This time, participation reached an unprecedented scale. Estimates suggested that over 30,000 inmates across California prisons took part at some point. It became one of the largest prison protests in U.S. history. The demands remained consistent. End long-term solitary confinement based solely on gang validation. Modify or eliminate the debriefing requirement. Improve access to programs and privileges. Ensure fair and transparent review processes for SHU placement. As the strike continued, the health of participants became a central concern. Medical teams monitored vital signs. Some inmates experienced severe weight loss. The situation drew national and international attention. Human rights organizations issued statements. Legal pressure intensified. The state could not ignore it. Pelican Bay, once a remote and largely unseen institution, was now at the center of a public debate. For correctional leadership, the challenge was balancing security concerns with growing demands for reform. Officials maintained that SHU policies were necessary to control gang violence. But the scale of the protest forced a reassessment. Eventually, California agreed to significant changes. The most important of these was the development of a step-down program. Under this system, inmates in the SHU could progress through a series of stages based on behavior and participation, eventually earning a pathway back to general population without mandatory debriefing. This marked a major shift in policy. Gang validation criteria were also revised. Rather than relying solely on association indicators such as tattoos or artwork, the system moved toward requiring stronger evidence of active involvement in gang-related misconduct. Then came the legal turning point. In 2015, a federal court settlement in the case of Ashker versus Governor of California effectively ended the practice of indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang affiliation. Thousands of inmates across the state, including many from Pelican Bay, were released from long-term SHU placement. For some, it was the first time in decades they would leave isolation. The impact was immediate and uncertain. Correctional officials prepared for potential violence as former SHU inmates re-entered general population units. Observers questioned whether individuals who had spent years in isolation could safely reintegrate. In many cases, large-scale violence did not occur. Instead, something more complex unfolded. Some inmates struggled to adjust. After years without regular human interaction, even basic social environments could feel overwhelming. Noise, movement, and proximity to others created new challenges. Others adapted more quickly, navigating the transition with caution. For the prison system, the reforms marked a shift in philosophy. Isolation was no longer used as broadly or indefinitely as before. Oversight increased. Review processes became more structured. The SHU remained, but its role changed. Pelican Bay itself was transformed. Not physically, the concrete walls, the cells, the architecture remained the same. But operationally, the prison entered a new phase. The hunger strikes had forced visibility. What had once been hidden behind layers of distance and policy was now part of a national conversation. The debate over solitary confinement extended beyond California, influencing discussions across the United States. Pelican Bay became a case study. For some, it represented necessary control in the face of organized prison violence. For others, it became evidence of a system that had gone too far. The hunger strikes did not resolve every issue. Questions about the long-term effects of isolation, the role of prison gangs, and the balance between security and human rights remain ongoing. But they changed the trajectory. They showed that even within one of the most controlled environments in the country, collective action could reach beyond concrete walls. And they revealed something fundamental about Pelican Bay. It was not just a place where power adapted. It was a place where resistance could emerge, quietly at first, then loudly enough to be heard across an entire system. The unseen power plays inside Pelican Bay were not only about control. They were also about the moments when control was challenged. And those moments reshaped the prison in ways that still echo today. Pelican Bay was built to control power, to isolate it, to silence it, to break it. But what this prison revealed is something far more complex. Power doesn't always disappear when you lock it away. Sometimes it adapts. It becomes quieter, harder to see, harder to stop. Inside those concrete walls, influence didn't rely on movement. It relied on reputation, loyalty, and communication that survived even in isolation. The hunger strikes changed the system. The courts forced reform. Thousands left the SHU after years in silence. But the question still remains. Did Pelican Bay truly break the system of control? Or did it just push it into the shadows? If this documentary gave you a deeper look into what really happens behind prison walls, subscribe now for more real, fact-based crime documentaries that go beyond the surface. Comment below. Do you think isolation can truly stop power, or does it only change how it operates? Until next time, stay informed, stay aware, and remember, some of the most powerful moves are the ones no one ever sees.